There's been a lot of discussion about President Trump and the Russia probe. Who else is involved and who else faces charges or jail time as a result? Jennifer Bellamy joins us now with a look at who's who in this investigation. Jennifer.
Special counsel Robert Mueller and his team interviewed about 500 people during their 2-year investigation, and some familiar names played big roles in the outcome. Here's a look at the major players so far in the Mueller investigation. There's Robert Mueller himself. In May 2017, U.S. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein appointed him special counsel to oversee a Justice Department investigation about allegations the Trump campaign worked with Russia to influence the 2016 election. He worked in 3 U.S. attorney offices, acted as Assistant Attorney General for the Justice Criminal Division, and FBI Director for 12 years. Michael Flynn, retired 3-star Army Lieutenant General who served briefly as President Trump's national security advisor. Prosecutors say he lied when he said he hadn't talked with the then Russian ambassador about sanctions. He pleaded guilty to making false statements to the FBI, but sentencing was delayed so he could cooperate more with Mueller's investigation. Paul Manafort served as the Trump campaign manager for a few months and has fought various federal charges in Virginia and in D.C. In Virginia, he was accused of hiding millions of dollars from the IRS, money earned advising Ukraine politicians. A jury convicted him on 8 felony charges related to tax and bank fraud. He then pleaded guilty in D.C. federal court to illegal lobbying and agreed to cooperate with the Russia investigation. Months later, a judge voided his plea deals because Manafort repeatedly lied to Mueller's team. Donald Trump Jr., President Trump's oldest son and executive vice president of the Trump Organization, his job to acquire properties overseas. Senate Judiciary and Intelligence Committees questioned him about a June 2016 meeting with Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, and a Russian attorney at Trump Tower in New York. He said the meeting was about Americans adopting Russian children, but then said it was political in nature. He admits he agreed to the meeting because he thought he might get damaging information about then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and trusted advisor, he met with British music publicist Rob Goldstone, who said prominent Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump Jr. and Paul Manafort were also part of that meeting. And there's the Russians. The Mueller team indicted 12 Russian nationals who allegedly hacked into the Democratic National Convention server and stole classified documents. The operation, allegedly instructed by the Kremlin and carried out by a military intelligence agency. A trial date hasn't been set.